In the summer of 1971, 24 ordinary young men walked into a basement at Stanford University. Some of them would leave traumatized. Some would become people they did not recognize. And one man, the scientist running the whole thing, would later admit that he lost himself too. This is the story of the Stanford Prison Experiment. An experiment so disturbing, so controversial, and so deeply contested that psychologists are still arguing about what it actually proved. More than 50 years later, Philip Zimbardo was not an unknown figure when he designed this study. By 1971, he was already a respected social psychologist, a professor at Stanford, a man who had spent years thinking about one particular question. Why do good people do terrible things? Not monsters, not criminals, ordinary people. He believed the answer had less to do with individual character and far more to do with situation. Put a person in the right environment, give them a role, give them power, or take it away, and something shifts. Something fundamental. His earlier work had explored de-individuation, the way people behave differently when they feel anonymous, when identity dissolves into a group or a uniform. The prison experiment was meant to push that idea further than anyone had gone before. The setup was straightforward. Zimbardo and his team would create a simulated prison in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building. They would recruit volunteers, randomly assign them to play either guards or prisoners, and observe what happened. The study was funded by the United States Office of Naval Research, which was interested in understanding the psychological causes of conflict between military guards and prisoners. That funding. Detail matters. It tells you something about the world this experiment was born into, a world shaped by Vietnam, by the brutality of military prisons, by a country asking hard questions about authority and obedience. They advertised in local newspapers. The ad offered $15 a day, which was a reasonable sum in 1971, for participation in a psychological study of prison life. Over 70 men responded. Zimbardo and his team screened them carefully. They ran psychological tests, conducted interviews, eliminated anyone with a history of mental illness, criminal behavior, or drug abuse. What they were left with was, by design, a group of psychologically stable, healthy young men, mostly white, mostly middle-class college students. Random assignment then divided them into two groups, 9 guards, 9 prisoners, and 6 alternates who would step in if needed. The prisoners were not told exactly when the experiment would begin. That was deliberate. On a Sunday morning in August, Rio Palo Alto police officers arrived at the homes of the men assigned to be prisoners. They were arrested on charges of armed robbery or burglary, handcuffed, read their rights, put in police cars, and driven to the station. They were fingerprinted. They were blindfolded. Then they were taken to the Stanford basement. At the mock prison, they were stripped, deloused, and issued a uniform, a smock with a number on it and no underclothes. They were given a chain to wear around one ankle. Their names were replaced with their numbers. They were assigned to small cells, 3 men per cell, and locked inside. The guards were given khaki uniforms, reflective sunglasses, the kind that prevented eye contact, wooden batons, and a set of rules they were allowed to enforce however they saw fit, within certain limits. No physical violence was permitted, but beyond that, they had significant discretion. Zimbardo himself took on the role of prison superintendent, not merely observer. That decision would become one of the most criticized aspects of the entire study. For the first day, not much happened. The men knew each other was playing a role. They felt self-conscious. Things felt almost theatrical. And then, on the second day, the prisoners rebelled. They barricaded themselves in their cells, ripped off their numbers, taunted the guards. The guards, apparently surprised, responded with force. They used fire extinguishers to blast the prisoners away from the cell doors. They stripped the prisoners, took their beds, put the leaders of the rebellion into solitary confinement, a small dark closet, and began using psychological tactics to break up group solidarity. They created a privilege cell where prisoners who had not participated in the rebellion were given better food and their beds back. Then, just to create confusion and distrust, they moved the well-behaved prisoners back to the regular cells and moved some of the troublemakers into the privilege cell. The prisoners began to doubt each other. The tactic worked. What followed over the next several days is the part of the story that made the Stanford Prison Experiment famous. The guards began working in shifts, 8 hours each, and the behavior between shifts varied considerably. Some guards were described by observers as tough but fair. Others became what Zimbardo's team called good guards, who bent small rules in favor of prisoners. But a subset of guards, particularly on the night shift when they believed they were less likely to be observed closely, became genuinely cruel. They forced prisoners to do push-ups, sometimes with a guard's foot on their back. They made prisoners repeat their ID numbers. They woke prisoners in the middle of the night for arbitrary counts. They denied prisoners bathroom access, forcing them to use a bucket in their cells. They made prisoners clean those buckets with their bare hands. They humiliated them. The prisoners, meanwhile, were deteriorating. One prisoner, referred to in the records as Prisoner 8612, began showing extreme emotional disturbance within 36 hours. He was screaming, crying, and raging. Zimbardo and his team initially thought he was faking in order to get out. They did not immediately release him. He was eventually let go, but only after a priest who had been brought in to play the role of a prison chaplain expressed concern, and after Zimbardo later acknowledged he had waited too long. 4 prisoners were released early due to emotional breakdown. One developed a psychosomatic rash over his entire body. After his appeal to be released was denied through a mock parole board process. The parole board, which included Zimbardo himself, denied multiple requests for release, even from prisoners who said they were genuinely suffering. Zimbardo later described how completely he had absorbed his role as superintendent. When he heard rumors that there might be a mass escape attempt, his first instinct was not to think like a scientist. It was to think like a prison warden. He called the Rio Palo Alto Police Department to ask if he could move his prisoners to an actual jail for the night. The police declined. He was annoyed, not because he had lost his scientific perspective, but because he had genuinely been worried about security. When a colleague, Christina Maslek, who would later become his wife, visited the experiment and saw prisoners being marched to the bathroom with bags over their heads, she was horrified. She told Zimbardo that what he was doing to those young men was wrong. She was reportedly the only one among the many visitors to the experiment who raised that objection directly. Her reaction shocked Zimbardo into seeing what he had become blind to. He ended the experiment on the 6th day. It had been planned to run for 2 weeks. When the results were published and Zimbardo began presenting the experiment to the public, the story spread rapidly. It seemed to offer a clean, powerful lesson. Ordinary people, when given power over others, will abuse it. Ordinary people, when stripped of identity and autonomy, will succumb. Situation shapes behavior more powerfully than character. It felt like an explanation for Abu Ghraib. It felt like an explanation for Nazi guards. It felt like an explanation for every institution where cruelty had flourished behind closed doors. The experiment became a staple of psychology textbooks. It was discussed in ethics courses, political science classes, management training programs. Zimbardo himself became a public intellectual, writing a best-selling book called The Lucifer Effect, in which he explored the experiment and its implications in depth. And then the question started. The criticisms of the Stanford Prison Experiment are not minor quibbles. They go to the heart of what the experiment actually showed, and whether it showed anything scientifically reliable at all. The first and most fundamental problem is the sample size and lack of replication. 9 guards and 9 prisoners is an extremely small group from which to draw sweeping conclusions about human nature. No independent research team ever successfully replicated the core findings under controlled conditions. The second problem is the question of demand characteristics. In psychology, demand characteristics refers to the phenomenon where participants in a study behave the way they think they are supposed to behave, based on cues from the researchers or the experimental setup. Critics argued that Zimbardo's experiment was saturated with demand characteristics. The participants knew they were in a study about prison life. They had watched prison films. They had cultural scripts about how guards and prisoners behave. Were they actually transforming under situational pressure, or were they performing the roles they had been implicitly told to perform? That question became far more pointed in 2018 when a researcher named Ben Blum published an article based on newly available audio recordings of conversations between Zimbardo's research assistants and the guards. What those recordings appeared to show was troubling. Before the experiment began, one of Zimbardo's lead research assistants, David Jaffe, explicitly told the guards to be tough, to not show weakness, to really get into the role. The guards were, according to this account, not simply placed in a situation and observed. They were coached. They were told what was expected of them. If that is true, the experiment's central claim, that the situation alone produced the cruelty, becomes much harder to sustain. One of the most dramatic cases was a guard who later said he had consciously modeled his behavior on a character from Cool Hand Luke, a 1967 film about a brutal southern prison. He was not transforming spontaneously under situational pressure. He was acting. He said as much years later in interviews. He claimed he felt he was giving Zimbardo the results Zimbardo wanted. A prisoner, similarly, gave an interview in which he described his emotional breakdown as partly deliberate, a performance designed to get him released. He later walked back parts of that account and said his distress had been genuine. The truth of his experience remains contested. Zimbardo has defended the experiment vigorously over the decades, though he has also acknowledged its methodological limitations. He has argued that the coaching given to guards was minimal, that the behavior that emerged went far beyond anything instructed, and that the distress of the prisoners was clearly real. The debate between Zimbardo and his critics has at times become quite sharp, but the criticisms are now mainstream. Major psychology textbooks that once treated the experiment as definitive now include substantial sections on its contested validity. There is also a deeper ethical critique. The experiment lacked proper informed consent. The participants could not have anticipated what they were agreeing to. Zimbardo himself played a dual role as researcher and prison superintendent, creating a fundamental conflict of interest. There was no adequate monitoring system that could have triggered an independent decision to stop the experiment. The prisoners' requests to leave were treated as parole hearings, rather than as the genuine right to withdraw from a study that all participants had legally agreed to be able to exit. By modern ethical standards, this experiment could not be conducted today. The standards that now govern psychological research, including the requirement for independent ethics review, genuine informed consent, and the right to withdraw, were shaped in part by the failures revealed by studies like this one. And yet, and this is the genuinely complicated part, the experiment's impact on psychology and public understanding of human behavior has been enormous, even if the science behind it is disputed. It forced the field to grapple with the ethics of research on human subjects. It pushed psychologists to think more carefully about the power of institutional roles. It contributed to discussions about prison reform, about military conduct, about the conditions under which ordinary people become capable of cruelty. Whether or not the methodology was sound, the questions it raised were real. Zimbardo testified before Congress in 1971, shortly after the experiment ended, advocating for reforms to the United States prison system. He argued that prison environments themselves produced violence and dehumanization, regardless of the character of those inside them. That argument, contested as its experimental basis may be, has been influential in ongoing debates about incarceration, solitary confinement, and the treatment of people in custody. The Stanford Prison Experiment exists now in a strange place. It is simultaneously one of the most famous psychological studies ever conducted and one of the most questioned. It is taught to students as a landmark moment in the history of social psychology and simultaneously offered as a cautionary tale about bad science. Both of those things are true at the same time, which is itself a kind of lesson. What the experiment undeniably showed is that research can get away from its researchers, that a scientist can become so embedded in what he is studying that he loses the ability to evaluate it clearly, that the line between observer and participant is not always as stable as we want it to be. Zimbardo, to his credit, has talked about this openly. He has said that the experiment changed him, not just those who participated. So what are we left with? A basement in California, the summer of 1971, 24 young men who signed up for $15 a day and got something entirely different. We are left with footage of prisoners shuffling in lines with bags on their heads. We are left with recordings of guards speaking in cold, contemptuous voices to other young men who had done nothing except be assigned a different number. We are left with a scientist who lost his objectivity and a woman who walked in from outside and saw clearly what he could no longer see. And we are left with the question that the experiment raised, whatever its flaws, and that no amount of methodological criticism can make disappear. Under the right conditions, with the right authority structures in place and the right costumes and the right permission, how far would you go? Not a monster, not someone broken from childhood. You, a psychologically healthy person in the right situation. The uncomfortable answer to the Stanford Prison Experiment suggested, and that decades of subsequent research has continued to explore, is that the situation matters more than we want to believe. Not because character does not matter, but because we consistently overestimate how much our character would protect us, and we consistently underestimate how powerful the pull of a role, a uniform, a chain of command, and an implicit permission structure can be. We tell ourselves that we would have refused. We tell ourselves that we would have been the guard who let the prisoners sleep, who ignored the midnight count, who pushed back against the cruelty. Maybe that is true. The experiment cannot tell us for certain, partly because its methodology was flawed, and partly because there is no way to know what any individual would do until they are actually there. But here is what the Stanford Prison Experiment, for all its failures, leaves behind as a genuine and enduring provocation. The guards who became cruel were not selected for cruelty. They passed the same psychological screening as everyone else. They were, by every available measure, normal. And normal, it turns out, is not the same as safe. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.